Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Democracy Works. Thanks for joining us. This week, we are talking about gerrymandering. You might have heard about this recently with some things that have happened in Texas and in California, where the legislators there are drawing new congressional maps in the middle of the legislative cycle. And a question I've gotten a lot recently around that is, does this mean that redistricting is now a partisan issue? There have been a long history prior to that of nonpartisan, citizen-led groups working to create independent redistricting commissions and draw maps that allow voters to pick their politicians, not the other way around. And does what happened in Texas and California effectively stop or negate all of that work? And I think you'll hear from our guest today that the answer to that question is a resounding no. I talked with Emma Adams of Mormon Women for Ethical Government and Carol Kuniholm of Fair Districts, PA, both of whom have been involved in years-long efforts to create independent redistricting processes in their states. And they offer a lot of hope for what people in all 50 states can do to advance independent redistricting. So I hope you will leave this conversation feeling as inspired as I did. Emma Adams and Carol Kuniholm, welcome to Democracy Works. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. So I am excited to talk to both of you today about gerrymandering and redistricting at a time when it's on a lot of people's minds. It has moved, it seems, in the public consciousness from a grassroots, nonpartisan effort that I know the two of you have been involved with to something that is more partisan in nature, right? Republicans, Democrats, everybody kind of getting involved. And we will get to that. But first, I just want to introduce our listeners a little more to you and to your organizations and the work that you have done to promote redistricting reform in your respective states. So, Emma, let's start with you. You are part of Mormon Women for Ethical Government and are fresh off of a years-long, correct me if I'm wrong on that, effort to have Utah's maps redrawn. So tell us a bit about how your organization got involved and the work that you did.
Yeah, so I live in Salt Lake City, Utah, which has got one of the lowest scores for gerrymandering, or best score, depending upon how you look at it, I suppose. And when this saga started back in 2018, MWAG is the way I say our organization, was just kind of a baby organization. We were fairly new, cross-partisan, grassroots, pro-democracy. Our women really do come from along the political spectrum. And so when Better Boundaries and Legal Women Voters and others in Utah started advocating for this independent commission, it was an obvious thing for us to pick up and work on. And our members worked on it, and they shared it in their Facebook pages, and they got out and they got signatures. And it was something that was a really meaningful, one of our first steps, honestly, in forays into the nonpartisan democracy space. And then this process happened. It was this amazing process. The maps were drawn, all in the public eye and so participatory and everything you would want from something that is really helping build civic muscle. So when those maps were rejected by the Utah legislature and their own maps were put in place, that set us up for our current legal battle, which we were plaintiffs in, several of the individual plaintiffs are MWAG members. And together with the Legal Women Voters and an amazing legal team, we've been able to have a big win in which the maps have been, the current maps have been thrown out, and we should have new maps by November 10th at the latest is what we're looking at right now.
Yeah, that's great. And we'll come back to some of that in a minute. But Carol, you are with Fair Districts, PA, here in Pennsylvania, and your story is somewhat similar, somewhat different than what Emma just described. Walk us through how Fair Districts, PA, came to be, and the work that your organization did to have Pennsylvania's maps redrawn.
Yeah, so we are a fiscal project of the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania, and we began in January 2016 to lend support to efforts to change our state constitution to create an independent redistricting commission. So we have been working on that since 2016. We've never gotten a bill out of committee, but we've come close a few times, and we've presented information to over 1,300 meetings with over 50,000 people attending and collected over 120,000 signatures in support of an independent commission. And we have not, gotten a bill passed, but we were very active in getting better maps this time around, in creating citizen maps and in asking for a more open public process and advocating for better maps. The league here in Pennsylvania had a lawsuit in 2017, 2018, which was the first successful partisan gerrymandering litigation in the country. And we went from having the worst congressional maps in the country to some of the best congressional maps. And I would say that our current congressional map is probably one of the most responsive in the country. And our current House map is much better. Our current Senate map is not quite as good as we'd like, but certainly better than it was. So advocacy, public attention has made a difference. Still hasn't won the lasting change that we'd like to see in a constitutional amendment.
Yeah. Yeah. And speaking of that advocacy, talk about each of you how you talk about this issue with your fellow citizens, both from like explaining the wonky nature of map drawing, but also why people should care about this issue. What are some of the tactics and techniques that you found successful?
So I think I'll start with the success and then work backwards maybe a little bit. If you talk to people in Utah and if you go to the pages of the news stories about this and you go into the comment section, you'll find a very active, very well-informed debate happening amongst the citizens of Utah about this. They're talking about the Utah Constitution. They're talking about the process of the census. They understand from start to finish what this looks like and they understand representation. And that is not because they were born that way. It's because the groups, starting with the League of Women Voters, they just have to give so much credit. I'm so glad, Carol, that that's who you're associated with. Just this is a long time, many years, very determined, persistent effort by a truly cross-partisan, truly nonpartisan group of women in this case, who just had the stick with itness, frankly, to keep this in the public view and to do the hard work to help the public be well informed about it. And I don't know that there's any sort of magical formula I can give you here other than that a group of determined humans, in this case women, over a period of time who don't give up and who act with hope and know that what they're doing is what's best for representative democracy. These sorts of things happen in conversations. They happen and they read this article, then they read this article. And this is the sort of stuff that it's a long-term persuasion effort, and you have to have a lot of different people involved in it. And so there's no kind of magic formula to persuade people like it. But I will tell you, in Utah, having that process play out it's a persuasive mechanism in and of itself. Anyone who watched it play out got a sense of what it looks like when people come together across the aisle to draw maps that honestly take the map drawing out of the people who are incentivized to draw them in a certain way. And I think everyone understands that intuitively, that when you have power and you then get the chance to keep yourself in power, the impulse to do so is too much. It's too much to ask them to set that aside. So let's create this independent way to do it. And when people got to see the process and experience it and participate in it, it's hard to go back and take it away after that, because they've gotten a taste of what real good participatory democracy looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. And Carol, I know that's your dream for Pennsylvania, though it's a little tougher here because we don't have ballot initiatives the way that Utah does.
Yeah, so the challenge is we have to go through the state legislature. So we have to go through the people who draw the maps, are the people who set the legislative agenda, are the people who control the caucus finances, are the, so there's a lot of control wrapped up in just a few people, and challenging that is hard. And can we do it? We're not sure. So we continue to work on that. I would say that citizens know that it's wrong, as you said. Citizens. The most recent poll I saw by NBC, a large poll just came out. 82% of Americans think that we should have independent citizen redistricting commissions. 82% think legislators should not be in the business of drawing their own district boundaries. And it makes total sense. You don't let students grade their own papers. You don't get referees call their own games. You shouldn't be letting legislators choose their own voters. And people understand that. Getting those folks to give up that power is really difficult.
Yeah, and Emma, you saw that in Utah, right? When the legislature kind of took away the power, and that is sadly part of a much bigger trend that's happened, particularly around when things are passed through ballot measures. The legislature will sometimes step in and say, "Yeah, actually, we don't think so." And so talk about what that like. I know you went through the courts to ultimately, get new maps redrawn, but were there any efforts on MWEG's part to sort of work with legislators to try to get them to see things a different way?
We are all about peaceful, persistent persuasion, to use all the P's. I mean, this is our brand. This is who we are. This is frankly how we were kind of made as humans. And so so I think we have multiple efforts going on all at once. So certainly you have that effort of using the courts, which is a tool of democracy that is so important to use. And some may see it as adversarial, but we've never looked at it that way. We've looked at it as is you use the tools at your disposal. In this case, it's the Utah Constitution, and in this case, our Utah Supreme Court was all appointed and confirmed by a group of Republicans. So it's harder to make that partisan argument back here for that reason. But I think at the same time, my members in the state of Utah, we've got members at all 50 states, but Utah's obviously where our epicenter is. Those thousands of women are developing relationships with their legislators, are talking about these issues, are coming in pairs or in squads of Republicans, independents, and Democrats.
But it's sort of like working with these legislators. It's like trying to get turkeys to vote for Thanksgiving dinner. It seems to me that's kind of the battle that you're facing with trying to push this forward in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, that's certainly not my line. And I guess what I would say is there are many legislators who would very much like to change things because they know, as we know, that the current process puts far too much power in the hands of just a few gatekeepers. So just a few gatekeepers are the ones who decide everything. The challenge is how to make the case to them. And Emily, you mentioned your case. Your constitution gives you the right to alter and reform your government. Pennsylvania's constitution was the first to include that language. And we keep looking at that saying, the League of Women Voters has been trying to alter and reform our redistricting process for 40 years. How do we use that right of altering and reforming our government here in Pennsylvania when leaders can simply say, no, we're not going to do that? So the courts are really important. And fortunately, our state Supreme Court also embedded in our Constitution, and I believe in yours because it was copied into many constitutions, is the right to free and equal elections. And so our state Supreme Court said we have the right to free and equal elections. A gerrymandered map deprives us of that right. So the legislators haven't gotten the message that we have the right to alter and reform our government and we have the right to free and equal elections. But fortunately, so far, our court has protected the right to have better maps.
Maybe I could just add to that real quick, Jenna. I think the point that Carol's making is so important that there actually are a lot of people who won't speak publicly that they support it, but you're persuading them kind of in the background. And so it's a process. You get to the point where they're questioning maybe the process, they're questioning the power that their party holds or the other party holds. And then they will tell you privately, good job, keep going. And then so the next step would be to enable the courage to speak up publicly. And we are seeing some legislators in Utah doing that. So it's a process.
Yeah. So it feels like, certainly the two of you and the organizations that you've worked with, and I would have put, people like Katie Fahey in this camp as well, who led the charge in Michigan. It seems like there was momentum building, and perhaps still is. But are there other folks in other states that you have looked to or worked with or would hold up as examples of, successful grassroots, nonpartisan redistricting work?
I think it's important to not just look to the ones that have had success, but look to the ones that have had progress. And even I've been doing this long enough to know that sometimes we with campaigns or with efforts, we see them as this binary win-lose. But I'd seen efforts that are related to redistricting in other states that we have technically lost. We have grown a public interest in and built civic muscle as advocates and as participants that then carries you into the next one. So maybe you fell 100% short, but the reality is that's 47%. Maybe you fell 3% short, but 47% are now talking about it and thinking about it that never were before. I can't think of anything good and noble and virtuous in this country that's ever been really done overnight. I think sometimes, especially if you're kind of new to advocacy or it's something the Hollywood social media version of things getting done is greatly compressed. But anything that's worth doing is worth doing over a period of time and is worth getting yourself up again after failures and it's worth innovating around. And I would also argue that the relationships that are built among the coalitions and the members that work on this are in and of themselves a powerful thing. Because maybe you come together to work on a ballot initiative or you work on a legislative campaign, and then you end up, getting to know one another and you work on something else together. So there's radiating effects out and there's leadership development and there's empowerment that happens that is good, in spite of whatever, if you don't get the outcome you want. And I think sometimes we want democracy to be like this win-lose thing when it's process and the how is just as important, if not more important than the actual outcomes.
Absolutely. And I love that phrase, civic muscle. It's certainly going to be needed, especially in the redistricting world now that the parties have gotten into the fray. I just wonder what each of you, what your reactions were when you heard, I guess, first about what was going on in Texas and then sort of California's rebuttal to that.
It's kind of heartbreaking, to be honest. It's very sad, and I'm an unaffiliated voter, and I fear that it's kind of like the parties have forgotten that voters matter, and they've decided that the parties matter, and the party leaders are the ones who decide what's going to happen, and voters are really very much pawns in that game. And I think the sad thing is when voters feel like they're pawns in the game, they just step out. And I think that civic muscle that Emma was talking about, that's so important. You can make voters feel like they just don't matter and they just stop voting. So when I looked at Texas, I was really intrigued because it looks like there's possibly more Democrats than Republicans in Texas, and yet the turnout for Democrats is very, very low, and the turnout for Republicans in 2024 was very, very high. And my thought, as I've watched what California is doing, is, wow, if I had millions of dollars, which they're going to spend millions of dollars in California overturning the independent redistricting map. If I had millions of dollars, I would be hiring young organizers in Texas to go door to door to show people the maps, to talk to them about, hey, your voice is being taken away. You need to register. You need to vote. You need to come out. I mean, you need to engage. And so, to me, the answer of harm to democracy is not to step back from democracy, but it's to re-engage democracy, to promote democracy, to strengthen democracy. And if you're going to invest, why invest in overturning a citizen-drawn map and drawing a new one? Rather, invest in helping people understand what's at stake, that they have a role to play, and that if they play that role, they could create a dummy mander, which is a gerrymander that stretches too far and gets overturned. And so I find the whole thing very disheartening. And the challenge for voters is to say we refuse to be treated as pawns, and we're going to still lean in, and we're still going to take agency ourselves, and we're still going to insist on being heard. It's disheartening to watch what's taking place.
Yeah, I think it's either bad luck or good luck that the Utah win came in the middle of the battles elsewhere, because it's a different situation at a time when Texas and California are rushing to gerrymander, and Utah we're saying no to gerrymandering. And frankly, it is frustrating to watch that narrative get lost or spun more in the national press than the local. The local Utah press has been extraordinary. There's been multiple reporters who have followed this, have done a really good job showing the nuance. And then I open up a news article with the national press, and who do they ask? They asked us to give a quote, a Democrat and a Republican from the party. And they give a partisan spin on what's happening in Utah. Do they claim victory or they claim, defeat and judicial tampering? And so that is unfortunate. So I think maybe it's a loss overall that it happened in the middle of this, which is why I really appreciate opportunities like this to come on platforms and say, no, what we're saying in Utah is no gerrymandering. It's very, very different. It just is getting kind of swept up in the time, and it took a long time for us to get a judgment in Utah. But when you read that, you know why, because it's very thorough. The judge, I think, my guess is she felt the weight of what she was having to rule on, and really took the time to write something that was quite thought out. So we'll take what we got and we'll move on to the next thing. I'm glad that it's getting the attention nationally what's happening in Utah. I wish it wasn't getting a partisan spin, because that's just not reflective of what's happening.
I think that some of the reason maybe people feel drawn to parties right now is because they feel like there is a threat. Whether you are a Democrat or a Republican, you feel like the other party is an existential threat to the country, to your particular way of life, to the things that you stand for. And that one, I think, leads to the desire for a short term fix, short term solution. We just have to win, right? And that makes it, much more difficult to advocate for long term, slower process changes like we've been talking about here today. So I wonder what you would say or what you have said to that argument about, well, we're in a crisis right now, and politics is the only way to get out of it.
I refuse to be ruled by fear. And when someone is trying to use fear to, I would say to everyone, develop your antenna for when someone is trying to utilize fear to persuade you that someone is the enemy who is not, and that the urgency level is so high that you must turn against others. Like, to me, that's just fundamental human decency that has been, abused in this fractured media environment in which, which those who understand psychology and understand marketing and understand how to get people to do stuff would utilize fear as their number one tactic. And it's hard not to feel that way sometimes. I'm not saying that you should, I'm not being a Pollyanna. I'm not saying everything's fine. I'm very, very deeply aware of the threats that are plaguing us at this moment. We may disagree about all the different threats, but they're there. But I think it's very American and patriotic to refuse to succumb to that fear, to look that fear straight in the eye, and to choose and to be very to understand and know that there are real problems, but then to choose to find the people to work alongside who are going to be courageous alongside us, who are going to decide that I'm not going to be ruled by that, and I'm going to look for solutions that aren't dependent upon rallying that part of my brain, that reptilian part of my brain that wants me to turn against each other, turn against my own family and friends. And I'm going to choose to find those people. And if you have that mentality and you start looking around, you will find an abundant number of Americans who care, who want to do things to break kind of partisan power, and who will frankly nourish and enrich you in the process. I always say I am not interested in being involved with anything that doesn't make people doesn't make people better in the process. So if it's turning you into something that makes you feel hardened and everyone is a threat, and it closes your heart off to relationships, then that to me is like a warning sign that I need to shift my focus, shift my the group that I associate with, and open myself up to some new experiences with different people.
The challenge is that we need more leaders like you, Emma. We need people who are able to say it's not us versus them. I think there's so much effort to divide us, to say us versus them, rural versus urban, um, lifelong Americans against immigrants, Republican against Democrat, and to say we're all Americans and we all thrive when we all thrive. I've been watching our budget impasse here in Pennsylvania, and if our cities are strangled, our entire economy is strangled. We all are harmed by that. So how do we remind each other that what's best for you is also what's best for me, and what's best for one community is going to help all of our communities. And so how do we move in that direction? I think it's really important that we remember that the loudest voice is not always the most accurate voice. And so in this partisan escalating fight, you hear people saying, well, you can't show up, with a knife to a gunfight. And I think, number one, can we not discuss our political engagement in terms of knives and guns? I mean, I think that's just so horrifyingly toxic. But then also to say there are many people who are not, who do not want to be in a fight at all. What they really want is political leaders who talk to everybody, who meet with everybody, who look for solutions that work for everybody. I had a recent interaction with a legislator who's very different from me, different part of the state, probably different background, different age, probably different part. I'm unaffiliated. I know what affiliation he was, but I'm unaffiliated. we had a really good conversation about the fact that that issues are divided as, this thing is Republican and this thing is Democratic. And what communities actually need is nuanced solutions that have a little bit of all things, that you can't, that those conversations are currently not possible, that they're not allowed, they're not enabled, and that legislators themselves are struggling with, we can't solve real problems if we can't, if the solutions that we want to talk about are suddenly labeled as, we can't talk about that because you're this party. And so we've got to find a way past that. I think the truth is most Americans are really tired of the divisiveness, really tired of the conversation about knife fights and gunfights, really saddened by the political violence that we see escalating, and that we have to find an off-ramp. And I do think the off-ramp is some real important structural changes, less partisan, get rid of partisan redistricting and move towards people-based redistricting, lower the money in politics, open the primaries, but also change the way that we talk about each other and change the way that we talk to each other. I think that's really important.
Yeah. Quickly here before we wrap up, Carol, you mentioned the phrase dummy-mander a little bit ago. Can you just say more about what that is and how it could potentially lead the partisan gerrymandering efforts recently to backfire?
Yeah, so dummy-mander, when you gerrymander, you're taking a number of voters and spreading them across more districts than they actually would have, which means you're spreading them a little bit thin. A dummy-mander is when you spread, you've already got a gerrymander, which has spread your majority thin, and a dummy-mander is you're going to spread it even more thin so that you get even more districts. You're assuming that the voters will vote just the way that your math is saying that they're going to vote. And if your math is off, you've spread them so thin that you could actually end up losing more districts than you're trying to gain. And that's what a dummy-mander is. And there's a lot of assumptions going on with what's happening. In Texas, there's assumptions that Latino voters are going to vote the way that they did in 2024. Good luck with that, I would say, from what we're seeing take place. You're assuming that people who came out to vote for President Trump are going to come out and vote in a mid-cycle election. Good luck with that. You're assuming that people aren't going to kind of look at their pocketbook and say, "Oh, all those things I was promised aren't actually happening. Maybe I'll go vote something different." So there's a lot of assumptions going on in this redistricting battle. How that plays out is anybody's guess. I would say I would rather bet every time on democracy. That's what I'd rather bet on, than to assume that you can control the outcome to that degree. And dummy-mander is quite a possibility in Texas and possibly other states. I've been seeing stats on many of our states that we assume are red or blue are actually much more purple than we know. And the reason they look red or blue is because some parts of the state have just kind of said, "Oh, well, they're not listening very well to me." And I would say in all of our states, what we really need is heightened civic engagement, heightened understanding of why our votes matter, heightened encouragement of people to register and to turn out and vote, and ways to help them understand why that's so important.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent note to end on. We will link to Fair Districts PA and MWEG in our show notes if listeners want to learn more about those organizations. And I'll also put a few others in there to nonpartisan reform groups that are working across the country, much like both of you are. So Carol and Emma, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having us again. Thanks for talking.
So much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Carol and Emma, for joining us. I really enjoyed that discussion, and in large part because I think we really ended on a very optimistic note. A lot of the values that we kind of put forward on the Democracy Works podcast were really front and center in some of that discussion. In particular, the way in which collectively acting really does matter and can influence policy and change. I really appreciated Carol's comment about democracy really taking work and taking energy, because I think we can use this as a model to kind of reinvigorate some of the work that we're doing in terms of building civic engagement, both in terms of teaching about, some of the components of how government works and how we can be involved in that government, but then also in supporting those components, right, of the components that make democracy function the way it's supposed to function. So there's certainly some negative things to pull out there, but I at least want to start us on a positive and affirming note.
I have to appreciate that, Cyan. Emma, I mean, both Emma and Carol are doing this amazing work. One of the things that stood out to me is that Emma represents a group of citizens whose name includes the word ethical government. And I just thought that, that was really important because, what they're saying is that we want government that is representative, is ethical, is moving in a direction that we can agree on together. I just not to sour the mood, but I just think that the Utah case is so wild to me because Utah has two Republican senators, four Republican House members. They get 4 seats in the House. They have a Republican governor. They have Republican supermajorities in both chambers of their state legislature. And then they have a proposition that was supported by over half of their voters to have this independent commission for redistricting. And then you have state legislators who are fighting against their own constituents. I think, the work that Emma and Carol are doing is reinvigorating. I think maybe, I don't know, it's kind of like a double edged sword that these state legislators are also reinvigorating Americans to see that this kind of idea that you represent us is like there's like a veneer that's being pulled back. Um, but I again appreciate the hard work that they're doing. And the fact of the matter is that in Utah, they have a system that allows citizens to put forth referenda or initiatives, legislation like that can kind of go around these folks who are trying to fight against their own citizens, where Pennsylvania does not have that. And so, in the case of Pennsylvania, the work is going to take longer because they are having to ask the people who have been voted in by a system that works swimmingly for them now to do something else. But maybe perhaps to bring it back on an upswing is that both Carol and Emma highlight the necessity of taking a long view, that big change takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of people, it takes practice, it takes failure. Um, and, many of the kind of best things that we've seen in our history, women's right to vote, the end of Jim Crow, so on and so forth, took decades. And so, like, would it be great if it didn't take decades for Pennsylvania's legislator to maybe do a thing that many of its constituents want? But we also can, I think, gain comfort in the idea that just because we don't see it happening right now doesn't mean that it's not going to happen, and that the room for those things to happen are being made by organizations like Carol and Emma's.
I think that's right. I don't know if we want to pivot, but I was Jenna, I thought you asked a really great question to Emma about kind of when is it time to like fight back. And whether we want to use the like bring a knife to a gunfight analogy, or whether or not we want to use the, but this is kind of what you were referring to in the beginning, Candace, this distinction between Texas and now California. And is it time to kind of put on our partisan blinders on purpose, right, to defend democracy through kind of using the same tactics that are being used against you, sort of thing. And I was I was surprisingly taken by Emma's response, right? That this is what does she say? Something like any time that someone is asking you to make a decision based on fear, it's probably worth taking a deep breath and kind of checking that and seeing if that's yeah if you actually want to make a decision led by fear. I thought it was a really calming, I keep making this sound too calm or passive, but maybe de-escalatory, that's a better way to say it, a de-escalatory way of framing, I think many of our notions, right, is to kind of fight back or push back in these ways using the same strategies that will ultimately undermine us and bite us in the ass later.
So there, that part of the conversation also stood out to me, and there are two things about that part. One has to do with the fact about how easy it is to conjure up fear and how easy it is to rely on fear when affective polarization, right? When people feel like, one, that their identity is wrapped up in their politics and that the other team is a threat.
An
So,
enemy,
in
right?
an enemy, that's right. Um, so that's one thing that came to mind. The second thing is the use of these words that folks are using: fighting fire with fire, bringing a knife to a gunfight. I heard someone reference a cold civil war. And words matter. And I think, for me, I'm like, yeah, some forms of democracy are worth fighting for, but the enemy is not my fellow citizens, right? It's like authoritarianism or one party systems or apathy, I think, is also an enemy worth fighting for, exclusion, so on and so forth. So I really did. Yeah, I appreciated that notion that if someone is trying to use fear as um, a rally around the flag strategy, that should send up red flags for you to sit back and think about what this means. I mean, the thing is that I think that the average person knows, like, okay, maybe gerrymandering in this way could give my party the upper hand today. But given that I don't necessarily trust the parties or my representative, I might choose something different next time. And, like the way that the political and demographic dynamics of this country are producing such uncertainty, that the rules that are used to give us an upper hand now can be later used, right, to put us under the thumb of the opposite party tomorrow. I think people really do understand this. And so heeding that warning around the use of fear, I think, is one that should probably put on a billboard somewhere.
And this, I think, was part of Carol's point too, right? That um, despite polarization, party allegiances are maybe becoming less salient for people, right? And so, or maybe it's less clear where the cleavages are going to be next round, right? And so I think it's less
Mhm.
clear for people exactly how it all plays out. I mean, this was the concept of dummy mandering, and I like this from a kind of comparative politics, strategic authoritarianism perspective, or even just strategic institutionalism. So we see this happen all the time in other contexts where states or international organizations try to set up policies that they think are going to benefit them, and then it backfires or they miscalculate for some reason. And so there was something about this kind of dummy mandering concept that really spoke to me. The self-serving strategies that can backfire, but also in light of Emma and Carol's conversation, this idea that we may not be able to predict as clearly as we could have the outcomes of elections in the way that gerrymandering may have made more sense 20 years ago than it does now. And so it's worth noting that we're seeing a doubling down on a strategy that actually,
Mm.
inserts ambiguity into the process when it's supposed to actually be doing the opposite.
Yeah, I think the second way that dummy mandering is going to backfire is through the idea that people feel like pawns in a game that has nothing to do with them. And that this whole kind of gerrymandering and responding to like changing the maps for these reasons and not because it helps the voter signals to people where they are in the game. And right now it sounds like voters are on the sideline. And that also sends signals to people to say, like, your vote doesn't matter. You should be disengaged. We will, your representatives will select their voters. The voters won't select their representatives. And that can have generational effects for trust, for partisanship, for political behavior. So there's all these ways that these kind of so-called, strategies to enhance one party's, um, s- you know, representation in a legislative body can have trickle down effects that are unintended, definitely, but also that will again come back to bite them in all sorts of ways.
All right. Well, I want to go back to ending on a positive note and to really thank Carol and Emma for all of the hard work they're doing, but also modeling, right, this hard work and the cross party energy that they are putting into building the networks and educating people, and again fighting the no I'm not wait I'm not going to say fighting the fight, working hard to kind of sustain our level of democracy in this kind of long game, right, and seeing kind of way farther down the road than other people are playing. And so it was really a pleasure to hear about all the great work they're doing. I'm Cyan from Democracy Works.
And I'm Candace Watt Smith. Thanks for listening.